空からどんどんゲームが降ってくる。衛星から次々と送られてくるゲームソフトの放送プログラムを家庭で楽しむスーパーファミコン専用衛星放送アダプターサテラビュー。
Many of Nintendo's most bizarre innovations launched in the 90s, and lately we've been diving deep into a few of them, like the Nintendo Power cartridge rewrite system and the internet-powered 64DD, two failures that never left Japan. There was also the Super Famicom CD drive, which would have doubled the system's bitage from 16 to 32. But probably Nintendo's most futuristic experiment was the Satellaview, an add-on that beamed games down to Super Famicoms via satellite. It was basically Xbox Game Pass without a subscription fee. In fact, Nintendo made a deal with Microsoft to bring their content to PC, and teased Satellaview continuing into the next console generation. Satellaview got exclusives from some of gaming's biggest franchises, like Mario, Zelda, Kirby, F-Zero, Fire Emblem, and Dragon Quest. A lot of less famous games too. Like this Nintendo gem, where you investigate a bunch of black people for murdering an old white lady, all while listening to some licensed hip-hop from artists like DJ Cash Money and Public Enemy. You'll hear more about all those games later. But Satellaview was more than just games. It was a way of life, a community. Users were officially called Satellaviewers and interacted directly with the service in ways unthinkable today. There was truly nothing else like it, and never has been ever since. Unfortunately, just like Nintendo's other 90s ventures, Satellaview ended in failure. But that's getting ahead of the story. Before we detail the platform's rise, fall, and resurrection, let's go back and start at the very beginning. This is the full history of the Nintendo Satellaview. In the early 90s, cartridge manufacturing costs skyrocketed, forcing customers to pay higher and higher prices for Super Famicom games, from $80 in 1990 gradually up to $100 a couple years later. In some cases, as high as $150. Most of their competitors responded by switching to CDs, but after cancelling the SNES disc drive, Nintendo needed to find a new way of delivering games to its customers. Enter St. Giga, the first satellite radio company in the world. Founded in Tokyo in 1990, St. Giga made a name for themselves with their 24-hour Tides of Sound broadcasts, where listeners were treated to ambient music based on the time of day, the weather, and tide cycles. Vibes specially curated for a sunny morning, a rainy afternoon, cold winter night, and so on. St. Giga's director, Hiroshi Yokoi, said the goal was to relax listeners in waves of sound, quote, like a baby sleeps in the womb. There was no news, no talk, and no commercials. Instead, St. Giga stayed afloat by charging listeners $6 a month. They had a dedicated cult following, but never grew big enough to become profitable. After a few years, they were broke. Nintendo liked the cut of their jib though, so in 1993, they bought 20% ownership in the company and saved them from bankruptcy. Nintendo was now St. Giga's largest shareholder, and started planning a way to combine St. Giga's satellite technology with Nintendo's penchant for game creation. They had the same guys who designed the Super Famicom create an add-on specifically for this purpose, called the Satellaview. No expensive cartridges, no slow-loading CDs. Instead, games would be distributed through satellite broadcasts. There'd also be game-related talk radio, digital magazines, and much, much more. Satellaview launched in April 1995, priced at $180. Pretty expensive for an add-on, but Satellaviewers were not charged a subscription fee, meaning the games themselves were essentially free. I think that's a pretty consumer-friendly arrangement, Miyamoto told Famitsu. In the past, there might have been a game you thought looked interesting, but cost $100, and it could be hard to tell if it's $100 worth of fun just by looking at it. But on Satellaview, once you've bought the hardware, you've already paid for all the games in advance. So again, basically Xbox Game Pass without a monthly fee. Miyamoto went on to say that with Satellaview, you're essentially paying for an empty cartridge, which Nintendo would continuously refill with new games for years to come. So from that perspective, $180 was actually kinda cheap. From the business side, Satellaview was also funded with sponsored ads, which usually appeared after play sessions. We checked archived footage and also talked to some Japanese fans who were there in its heyday, and it seems ads were mostly for SNES games or other broadcasts. So yes, there were ads, but they weren't annoying toothpaste commercials or anything like that. A lot of free game demos were broadcast as well, which were advertisements in their own way and brought in additional revenue. Speaking of which, we've got more facts coming up, but first, a word from this video's sponsor, the Southern New Hampshire University. A few of us at DidYouKnowGaming have worked in the games industry before, and we know how daunting getting into the industry can feel. But SNHU can help you get your foot in the door with affordable degrees in art and design or programming. SNHU is one of the largest online accredited universities in the United States, and their expert teachers have tons of real-world industry experience, giving you valuable connections and insights during your course. Learn how to make realistic and immersive gameplay experiences, 2D and 3D graphics, or how to code your own games for Unreal Engine and more. SNHU also makes higher education highly affordable, with some of the lowest online tuition rates in the United States. You could even qualify for financial aid or be able to transfer previous college credits, and SNHU will continue to support you as you navigate your job search after your degree. So if you're interested in pursuing a job in the games industry, head over to snhu.edu/DidYouKnowGaming to explore how you can start your journey toward a game development degree today. And now, back to the trivia. The library was genuinely pretty impressive. Much more so than Nintendo's other 90s experiments. One of the first Satellaview games was BS: The Legend of Zelda, a 16-bit remake of the original Zelda, where you play as your Satellaview avatar with your choice of gender. These were sort of like Nintendo Miis of their era. Your avatar was the player character in a few other games as well, like BS Zelda: Ancient Stone Tablets, a pseudo-sequel to A Link to the Past that took place in the same overworld but set 6 years later with a new story, dungeons, side quests, and minigames. So 16-bit Ura Zelda, basically. Another big one was BS Super Mario USA, a direct sequel to the Super Mario 2 we got in the West. You know, the one that was a reskin of Doki Doki Panic. Then there was BS Super Mario Collection, which was more or less a remix of Super Mario All-Stars. BS F-Zero Grand Prix 1 and 2 were kinda like expansions to the original SNES game that added new cars, music, and racetracks. BS Marvelous Camp Arnold and BS Marvelous Time Athletic were alternate versions of Marvelous Another Treasure Island, a Zelda-like RPG released on cartridge and directed by Eiji Aonuma, who'd later become director of the mainline Zelda franchise. BS Famicom Detective Club: The Past That Disappeared in the Snow was the series' usual fare, a graphic novel murder mystery, but this time set in a winter village. BS stands for Broadcast Satellite, by the way. Those are the big first-party highlights, though Nintendo also made some original IP you've probably never heard of, like Mighty Pockets, a detective-themed board game with a lot of black characters, and licensed music from mostly black artists, including DJ Cash Money, Gangstar, Coolio, MC Hammer, Michael Jackson, the Jungle Brothers, and Public Enemy. Hard to believe, but it's true. Nintendo had some Zelda and Mario devs make a board game pretty similar to Clue, except it's animal detectives chasing a bunch of black people for murdering an old white lady. In the first case, the prime suspect is a gang leader whose name is literally just Black. Black the junk dealer. The other suspects are his associates, and you've got to figure out who done it while listening to hip-hop. Not only is this game real, it was also fairly popular with Satellaviewers. Now's probably a good time to mention that, unlike cartridges, a lot of Satellaview broadcasts had CD quality sound, which came in clutch for a game like Mighty Pockets. Another memorable first-party title was Satellaview, basically a collection of minigames and quizzes starring Toad as the main character. Satellaview was broadcast about 30 times over 4 years, making it the longest-running game on the system. Nintendo also did a remake of Excitebike, with Mario, Luigi, Peach, Toad, Wario, and Yoshi as playable characters. Second-party studios contributed as well, like BS Fire Emblem Arcania Saga from Intelligent Systems, a 4-level short story taking place in the middle of the original Famicom game's timeline. They also broadcast 4 maps for Super Famicom Wars, though it wouldn't be till later that the full game released through the Nintendo Power rewrite system. HAL Labs made Kirby's Toy Box, a collection of 8 smaller games, including baseball, pinball, and pachinko. And they released DLC for Shigesato Itoi's #1 Bass Fishing, which is pretty much what it sounds like, a fishing game with light RPG elements. Earthbound's creator, Shigesato Itoi, is a bit of an angler in real life, but here he just works at the bait shop. There's also substantial third-party support. Squaresoft invested in Saint Giga 2, and a few months after Chrono Trigger hit Super Famicom, they broadcast some spin-offs like Chrono Trigger Jet Bike Special and Radical Dreamers, a text-based visual novel serving as a side story to the main game. As supplementary material, they also released Chrono Trigger character and music libraries. Square made a few standalone exclusives as well, with the best probably being Treasure Conflicts, an RPG about treasure hunting with a lot of Mode 7 airship exploration and aerial dogfights. Enix made BS Dragon Quest, based on the 16-bit remake of Dragon Quest I that had come out a few years before, but now with extra side quests, NPC encounters, and lots more little changes. Then Marvelous released BS Harvest Moon, a farming simulator and pseudo-sequel to the regular Harvest Moon, which released on Super Famicom not long before. Honestly, there were too many Satella games for us to cover all of them in depth, but just know there were dozens of original titles, plus a back catalogue of older games like Lemmings, Wario's Woods, Link to the Past, and Mario Paint. You know, like how Game Pass doesn't only have new releases, it has a library of old ones too. Some exclusives were known as Soundlink games, and typically broadcast from 6 to 7 o'clock in the evening. What made Soundlink special was the radio component, enabling high-quality sound and voiceover from actors and developers. BS Zelda serves as a good example, as it was the very first.
君は壊れる壁や崖を見つけただろうか。爆弾をうまく使おう。老人や商人の洞窟から考える。
ゲームの映像に合わせて音声が迫り来るこの大迫力。ゲームの世界にアクションロールプレイングという名を知らしめたゼルダの伝説が全く新しい世界初音声連動番組となって君を直撃する BS ゼルダの伝説。しかもこの放送は全国同時放送だから、君たちは日本中のプレイヤーを相手に自慢の腕と技術を競い合うんだ。どう？すごいでしょ。
BS Zelda had some new music and plot details voiced by Zelda and Ganon, and the old man serving as the overall narrator. You know who I mean. The guy who says, "It's dangerous to go alone," and gives you his sword. Soon after that was BS Dragon Quest, which had voiceover from series creator Yuji Horii, reminiscing about the game's development and the franchise's evolution since the mid-80s. It also had quite a few characters with voice acting. BS Super Mario USA's characters chatted with each other and occasionally affected gameplay.
少し驚かせてやりましょ。わかりました、ピーチ姫。行くぞ。それ。どうかしら。
BS F-Zero had 3 announcers and some absolutely killer remixes. BS Detective Club had voice acting.
それがね、草野和夫が殺されたの。
And BS Fire Emblem had a lot of still image cinema.
神が来ました。Most of the add-on's best games were Soundlink, which made them unique experiences not possible on cartridge. They were only possible with satellites, but it was kind of a double-edged sword, and the technology had its downsides. Typically, Soundlink games released as 4 one-hour episodes, spread a week apart, and could not be played outside their time slot. In other words, you couldn't complete them start to finish at your leisure, and you also couldn't replay them later. If you wanted to play, let's say, Ancient Stone Tablets, you had to be at your TV from 6 to 7 PM 4 weeks in a row. Soundlink was the very center of the service and mirrored what TV watchers were accustomed to back then. They knew when their favorite show came on and made sure to be at their TVs when it started. That's not how things work nowadays, so it sounds kinda crappy from our modern perspective. And even in the 90s, it wasn't super convenient, which is why Nintendo tried to make up for it by rebroadcasting the best games pretty frequently. And to be clear, these weren't regular old games with a tacked-on time limit, they were designed to be played as 1-hour episodes. One benefit of that design was being able to have what were essentially leaderboards. A minute ago, you heard Satella Lady say you compete against other players. What she means is at the end of each episode, you get a completion ranking. In Ancient Stone Tablets, for example, you got points for stuff like achieving objectives and collecting rupees, and lost points for taking damage and getting game overs. Rank high enough, and you'd get some prizes in the mail from Nintendo. A lot of broadcasts weren't just games, though. Satellaviewers could listen to live talk shows, often focused on games and hosted by celebrities, or read digital magazines, some of which were about games and their developers, while others were just for general entertainment, and sometimes veered into bizarre and R-rated territory. The most famous of which was Lily Frankie Theatre. Maybe you've seen some out-of-context screenshots on Twitter or something. There were also digital versions of print publications, like Famitsu and Nintendo Power, along with newsletters from St. Giga and Nintendo announcing upcoming events, like an Itoi bass fishing competition where players had 1 hour to catch the 5 biggest fish they could find, with the top 100 winners advancing to a final round for special event lures and other real-life rewards. Itoi himself participated, and the contest got so popular that Nintendo held another a few months later. That was pretty common for Satellaview. If events and broadcasts were popular or heavily requested by fans, they'd get reruns. Many other games had competitions too, usually centered on item collecting, speedrunning, and achieving high scores. Free demos, crossword puzzles, quizzes. A lot of broadcasts felt like the kind of stuff you'd see in PlayStation Underground. Remember those? They were discs full of demos, interviews, and whatever miscellaneous content Sony felt like throwing at their fans. You could never do that on cartridge or VHS tapes, but those kind of grab bags worked well with the burgeoning CD format.
even more so for Satella broadcasts. Though a lot of it was performed live, which wasn't possible even on CD. A typical day's schedule was 14 hours of broadcasts, with a dozen or so games, a few magazines, demos, and a grab bag of this and that. A new broadcast started every 10 or 20 minutes, so there was always something to catch your interest and pull you back to your TV again and again and again. That's a rundown of the content, so now let's see what else gamers got for their $180. The Satellaview bundle had the kind of cords and hookups you'd expect, along with 2 cartridges. The first being a small 1 MB flash cart for storing games, magazines, and so on. Except SoundLink, most games didn't require you to be present at a precise time. You could schedule the system to download broadcasts at their specified hour, then they'd save to the flash card, so you could play later with no time limit. The idea is you'd be constantly deleting old titles and replacing them with new ones. Like Miyamoto said, getting a Satellaview's like buying an empty cartridge that's constantly refilled with new content. You could also purchase additional flashcards if you wanted to keep old stuff too. They cost $50 each, or you could win them in the leaderboards and competitions we talked about earlier. The flashcard snapped into the bundle's second cartridge, called BSX, The Story of the Town Whose Name Was Stolen. Boot it up, and you'd be in an RPG-style town with a story of its own that's continuously changing and getting updated via satellite. It had about 50 characters caught up in its ongoing drama, and an environment that changed with the seasons. There was an in-game economy where you could earn money, shops that sold stuff like fast travel portals, ponds for fishing, and so on. Satellaview magazine summed it up best. Quote, "The town whose name was stolen is actually a game in itself. Imagine an RPG without an ending, and you'll get the general idea. But it was more than just an RPG." Nowadays, download services are basically menus and thumbnails you scroll through. But on Satellaview, the town was the user interface. Want to play today's broadcast of Treasure Conflicts? Head to the museum. Want to play games saved to your flashcard? You can do that at your house. Want the day's news? Go to the news building. There's even a spot for daily pinups of hot Japanese girls. No joke. The town was also woven into some of the games themselves. Beating a game might give you an item to use in town, or unlocking a game might require you to spend some in-game currency. You could also use phone booths around town to get hints for games you've been playing. BSX was sort of a mix between Earthbound and Animal Crossing, but directly inspired by the early 90s mystery horror TV show Twin Peaks. Despite coming from America, it was super popular in Japan, and Koholint Island in Link's Awakening was also inspired by Twin Peaks. The show's about an FBI agent investigating the murder of a teenage girl in a mysterious small town. Likewise, the town whose name was stolen has a mystery of its own. Not only its name, but part of its history's been deleted. Just as you start investigating what the hell is going on, the townspeople start reporting UFO sightings and other weird phenomena. Every day the town's updated at noon, then again at 7 PM to continue the story. Every second day is a rerun, so if you can't play today, you can catch up tomorrow. The town's producer, Yusuke Akamatsu, said, "I think the ending a couple years from now will surprise Satella viewers. I hope one day it'll get adapted as a live-action film and become a hot topic like Twin Peaks." Akamatsu was a novelist by trade, so he also wrote a monthly story about a similar city that lost its memory, set in the futuristic year of 2010. The story's title was 2010, as a matter of fact. In case you hadn't noticed, that was kind of the vibe Satellaview in general was going for. We're playing satellite games. We're in the future. 2010 followed a 16-year-old girl who's forgotten her name in a dystopian, half-destroyed city ruled by a mysterious overclass. Every month it was published in Satellaview magazine, which also kept readers up to date on the minute-to-minute broadcast schedule, had lots of interviews and other Satella-specific content like game reviews. One defining aspect of the entire Satellaview culture was direct input from fans. Individual Satella viewers were featured in the magazine and wrote in to Satellaview's talk shows, where their names and letters were read live on air. They were encouraged to send in suggestions for characters and plot points that could be added in town updates, and asked which games they wanted to see rebroadcast or receive sequels. Fans were even encouraged to make their own games. Since there were no cartridge manufacturing costs, pretty much anyone could make a game and get it into the broadcast lineup, so long as it was good, of course. There are games that students bring us that maybe couldn't sell on cartridge for $80, Miyamoto explained, but they still have a chance for hundreds of thousands of people to play it thanks to Satellaview. Indeed, quite a few smaller games did make it to broadcast. Fans even made their own RPGs with RPG Maker, and their own shoot-'em-ups with Dazz, and some of those got broadcast as well. In a surprising turn, just a year after Satellaview launched, Nintendo made a deal with Microsoft to bring their games to PC, along with St. Giga's broadcast technology. Actually, they used the Japanese word for infotainment rather than games, and details were intentionally left vague because the service wasn't going to launch till a year later in summer '97. One thing they did put on record was that future subscribers would be paying less than $10 a month. Parsing their comments, it seems this might not have been Satellaview coming to PC exactly, though it seemed to be in the same ballpark. Meanwhile, in other interviews, Nintendo kept teasing that Satellaview could continue into the next generation via the 64-disc drive. Satellaviewers didn't know all the details about PC or DD, but regardless, they were excited for whatever came next. So, all this sounds pretty awesome, right? Nintendo president Yamauchi expected 2 million Satellaviews would sell in its first year on the market, then on into the future. There were over 17 million Super Famicom owners in Japan, so in other words, a projection that 10% of them would buy the add-on each year. And while they never provided Satella hardware sales, which is never a good sign by the way, St. Giga did publish active user counts. In early '97, they peaked at 116,000 users and trended downward from there. Needless to say, that was less than Nintendo had hoped for. Never mind 10% a year, as it turned out, only 1% of Super Famicom owners became Satellaviewers. Ever. Third parties pulled support around the same time. Satella magazine ceased publication, and the joint venture with Microsoft fizzled out to nothing. So why did it all fall apart? And how come gamers didn't jump on board? Well, first of all, Satellaviews weren't initially sold in stores. For the first 6 months, they were only available by phone call or mail order, which led to mostly only hardcore Nintendo fans buying one. Casual gamers, holiday shoppers, and normies don't tend to buy stuff if they don't see them in the stores, especially back before modern internet. Another problem was marketing. Nintendo only ran TV commercials for the first month, then limited themselves only to magazine ads. A very limited selection of cartridge games had promotional materials packaged in, like Yoshi's Island and Chrono Trigger. But for the most part, you'd have to already be subscribed to Nintendo-centric magazines to even hear about Satellaview. Then, of course, the competition. Sega and Sony released 32-bit systems in late '94, so by the time Satellaview launched in 1995, its 16-bit graphics looked ancient in comparison.
Nintendo had already announced their own 64-bit system as well. At the time, it was due out Christmas 1995, just a few months after Satellaview. Simply put, most gamers were more interested in buying a new console than spending an equivalent amount of money to upgrade an old one. And finally, the price. The add-on itself cost $180, almost as much as the base console, but you also needed a tuner and parabolic antenna to receive satellite signals. Now's probably a good time to mention, the add-on had two mascots, Satabo and Parabo, who personified the required equipment. Some Japanese televisions already had antennas and tuners built in, but if you weren't lucky enough to have that kind of TV, you were going to have to shell out another few $100 or rent them month to month. In Satella magazines, some parents said they spent over $800 on all of the hardware, which was more than double the price of a brand new PlayStation. Yeah, the games were free, but that didn't exactly get parents tripping over themselves to spend a week's wages on satellite equipment, just so their kids could play more Nintendo than they already were. Add up all those shortcomings, and the result was that only the most devout fanboys ended up buying one. Nintendo mixed up the broadcast schedule to try and turn things around, but the numbers kept trending south. At this point, St. Giga was profitable, but still saddled with debt from their radio days, to the tune of $88 million. That was big money back then. In early '98, Nintendo presented a financial recovery plan to St. Giga to make sacrifices and get their debt under control, but they refused to accept it. Nintendo was pissed, but owning 1/5 of the company wasn't enough to force it on them. Later that year, relations were further strained when St. Giga failed to apply for a government broadcasting license before the mandatory deadline. That led to Nintendo putting out a statement in August '98, saying they'd been planning to increase their investment in Satellaview, but because of their problems with St. Giga, now they weren't gonna do that anymore. Soon after, Nintendo announced they were cancelling all Satella game development, and as of April Fool's Day 1999, they'd be done supplying content entirely. In other words, as far as Nintendo was concerned, Satellaview was now cancelled. St. Giga tried running it on their own for a while, but with only 9 employees, they had very little choice but to reduce broadcast hours and rely on rerunning old games, since they didn't have any new ones. Active users peeled off pretty quick after that, down to under 50,000. That's when the plug got pulled for good, with Satellaview shutting down completely in summer 2000. St. Giga issued a goodbye, saying, "Farewell, Satellaview players. Since April, we've been broadcasting without any sponsors. We tried to get more sponsors to keep the service alive, but now we've decided to terminate broadcasting on June 30th, 2000, as we've determined it'll be difficult to find new sponsors in the coming digital era. Thank you very much for supporting our venture over the past 5 years." Further down in English, they told us, "I plowed of you forever." A year later, they were once again broke. But without Nintendo to bail them out this time, they went full-on bankrupt, and all their equipment, including 200 Tides of Sound cassette tapes, got auctioned off for a pittance. With their beloved add-ons now turned into paperweights, a lot of Satellaviewers fought to keep the community alive by staying in touch online, writing BSX Town fanfiction, and in some cases meeting up in real life. Nowadays, some hang out in dedicated Discord servers, which is where we found a few of them to get info for this video. And actually, after talking to those guys, we came away with a different perspective than we had going in. Nintendo appears to have lost a small fortune on Satellaview, but maybe that's not the right metric to measure its success, as we were originally thinking. Because really, Nintendo didn't care about the money. Not in the short term, anyway. That's why it was the only broadcast service on the market that didn't charge for content, and why its ads were so unobtrusive. It was the world's first video game broadcast system, and Nintendo was more focused on testing it out as a new distribution model rather than maximizing profits. They wanted to see if it was a viable long-term strategy as an alternative to expensive cartridges and slow-loading CDs. That's why even during the decline from its peak, Nintendo was still planning to invest millions more to upgrade the tech. They were playing the long game with their eye on continuing it to the next generation. Unfortunately, even viewed through that lens, Satellaview was still a failure. 99% of their own fans didn't buy one. Third parties abandoned them. The deal with Microsoft didn't pan out. And even their own partner, Saint Giga, let them down when the going got rough. That's why Nintendo bailed when they did. Not because it was losing money, but because the experiment had run its course. It had proven that broadcasting games wasn't a viable long-term strategy. So they ended the experiment. In the decades since, Nintendo's shown little interest in preserving that chapter of their history, or even acknowledging it. They rarely bring up Satellaview in lookbacks, interviews, or alongside other relics of their past. For example, in 2024, they did a big media blitz for Emio the Smiling Man to promote the new Famicom Detective Club, the fourth in the series. But in all their promotional videos, they pretended like BS Detective Club, which released 27 years ago, never existed.
後ろに立つ少女という2作品を発売したファミリーコンピュータディスクシステムのアドベンチャーゲームシリーズです。2021年に Nintendo Switch でリメイクしたんですけども、それをやってみてね、これは絶対にファミタンの完全新作を作らなあかん。30年越しの新作ですからね、プロット作りから脚本、カットシーンの演出。
It's weird he'd say that, since it's not the first new game since the disk system. Sakamoto's leaving out the third entry, which released on Satellaview in 1997. He was producer on it, just as he is now for Emio. A few months later, Nintendo updated F-099 by adding 5 tracks from the BS expansions, but glossed over where they came from, instead announcing them as, quote, 5 new tracks. Individual developers, on their personal accounts, proudly celebrated the historic nature of Satella content's return, but Nintendo themselves never mentioned it. We could list more examples, but you get the point. Nintendo routinely goes out of their way to avoid talking about Satellaview, let alone re-releasing any of its games. Some of you might be thinking, oh well, those games only came out in Japan, maybe that's why. But they've acknowledged the history of and re-released Japan exclusives countless times before, like when they made a huge deal of localizing the original Fire Emblem for Switch, and even Nintendo Power exclusives by adding Wrecking Crew 98 and Kirby Superstar Stacker to Worldwide Switch Online. But Satellaview specifically is persona non grata. Why? Without an official statement from Nintendo, we can only speculate. The lack of acknowledgement stems from their falling out with Saint Giga, and the absence of re-releases is for the same reason, plus maybe the tinkering it'd take to remove some games' SoundLink features. To be fair, there have been some more rare exceptions over the past quarter century. A few titles got re-released through the Nintendo Power system, including a couple reworked SoundLink games, which, by the way, proves that turning SoundLink into standard format games isn't an impossible task. Around the same time, Nintendo of America openly considered porting games to Super Nintendo, but sadly, that never ended up happening. In 2010, Intelligent Systems recreated BS Fire Emblem's maps for a bonus mode in Fire Emblem New Mystery of the Emblem. Then NCS ported Cyber Citizen Shockman Zero to modern consoles in 2017, and Square localized Radical Dreamers and bundled it in with a Chrono Cross remaster in 2022. Except those few edge cases though, preserving Satella games has mostly been left up to fans. Unfortunately, without Nintendo's help,
its games are harder to preserve than probably any other console to ever exist. Satella flashcards were only 1 megabyte, meaning they could usually only store one game at a time, along with some odds and ends like save data and magazines. Which kinda sucked in the 90s, but sucks even more now for preservationists, as it makes finding games a bit of a crapshoot. If flashcards held 10 games, it'd be relatively easy to buy up a bunch of carts from Japanese auction sites and preserve the full Satella library. But with only one game per cart, the odds of finding the less popular games are pretty thin. But the difficulties don't end there, because a lot of data for SoundLink games didn't even save to flashcards. How do you preserve something that was never saved or stored? Nintendo's presumably got their broadcasts on a hard drive somewhere, but preservationists are missing a lot of their data, especially audio. For some games, the missing data was integral to the core experience, while other games are still playable, but playing them feels like this. Since they can't be preserved as they once were, in some cases, fans opted to recreate these games instead. We made a video just last year detailing how fans recreated BSF-0 Grand Prix 2 using archived footage and artificial intelligence tools. But recreating SoundLink games with limited data can be so open to interpretation that some fan projects split down the middle. That's exactly what happened to the BS Zelda project. Half the team wanted a more pure Satella experience, while the other half wanted it to play more like a traditional Zelda game. Ultimately, there was a schism, and they broke up to make 2 separate BS Zeldas, both of which are pretty distinct. Over the years, fans have made most of the big Satella games playable in one form or another. BS Super Mario USA, BS Fire Emblem, and so on. But they're not the same as they once were, and the less famous games, like Mighty Pockets and Treasure Conflicts, don't have enough skilled fans willing to work countless hours for free to bring them back to life. But even if fan devs could resurrect every single game, Satellaview was a hell of a lot more than just the games themselves. Emulating fan recreations is kinda like watching a movie on Netflix after the last movie theater in the world's gone out of business. Yeah, it's basically the same content, but there's no arcades in the lobby, popcorn at the concession stand, trailers in the run-up, or booming surround sound in front of a 60-foot screen. You're just not getting the same experience. However, Satellaviewer wannabes will be glad to hear that there is something that comes kinda close. In the far reaches of the internet, there's a little place called Satellaview Plus, where users walk around the town whose name was stolen, consult a live broadcast schedule, download Satella games at specific times, read digital magazines, and listen to Tides of Sound, much like it was back in the 90s, except now in English. It's only a few months old, with just a couple hundred users, but the devs are steadily adding more content. When we talked to the 3 main guys, DDDev, Satellavini, and Riven, they said they've been working double time to get ready for the add-on's 30th anniversary celebrations, coming next April. So if you're trying to recapture what it was like for a Japanese kid back in the day, Satellaview Plus is as close as you're going to get. Though, as much as we applaud those guys, and many more preservationists who have worked tirelessly for years on end, like Halki and Cabusses, much of what made Satellaview what it was just isn't coming back. A lot of the digital magazines, live shows, developer interviews, and other miscellaneous contents being completely lost to time, with next to zero chance it'll ever be found. Even a lot of what was broadcast remains elusive. And I don't just mean getting all that content, I mean history's forgotten what a lot of broadcasts even were. The hard reality is that Satellaview was a time and a place, and only about 100,000 people were there to experience it. And, well, that's the story of the Satellaview. Early on, third parties were excited for what it would make possible. with Square and Enix publicly considering weekly ongoing adventures, broadcasting content that got cut from cartridge releases, and adding brand new DLC. St. Giga planned to branch BSX out into multiple towns and push its story forward. Nintendo was keen to expand with further investment and continue into the next generation with the 64DD. But ultimately, a lot of its promise was cut short, much like Nintendo's other failed experiments. It's fun to imagine all the great games we could have got if it had been a success. Sadly though, it wasn't. So we're only left with the scraps, as preservationists struggle to pick up the pieces, since Nintendo doesn't seem interested in doing it themselves. At least, not for the past 25 years. But who knows? Maybe someday they'll drop an all-inclusive, authentic Satella app into NSO, and what I'm saying now will have aged like milk. Did you also know that after Satellaview's failure, Nintendo's next big experiment was installing 7,000 cartridge rewrite systems all over Japan called Nintendo Power? The system ran for just shy of a decade and even got some exclusive games like Mario, Kirby, and Fire Emblem, as well as some original first-party IP like Famicom Bunko. It ended in failure too, unfortunately, but the technology and potential was as exciting as Satellaview. So if you want to hear all about it, click the video on screen. Or if you'd rather hear about the 5-year development of the SNES CD drive and the games it would have got, like Mother 3 and Night Trap, click the other video. Special thanks to our translator Jacob, Satellaview historian and programmer Cabusses for a lot of consultation and footage, the Satellaview Plus devs, Hard for Games for digitizing the Satellaview infomercial VHS tape, and 90s Satellaviewers like Halki and Harry Hotter, who helped us see what Satellaview was like in its heyday. And of course, thank you for watching. I proud of you forever.